and we are recording here with Zoomer Schopenhauer. He's one of the very few people that I have the pleasure of being mutuals on Twitter with, and therefore basically one of the 5 people I care about on that website. He is also a Substack writer, and his writing I find to be, well, maybe I just don't give Twitter posters enough credit, but I'm pretty critical of my own writing, and I think that there's a lot of people on both of these websites who are very successful, but being successful doesn't necessarily mean you're actually a good writer, in my opinion. But I think not only are his ideas interesting, but also he's just a good communicator. So I thought I would have him on. He did an interview with Geo not too long ago, I believe, and I guess we're going to get right into it here. So the name Zoomer Schopenhauer always gave me the impression that you were a big fan of the man, but reading some of your material, you also are a big fan of Nietzsche. So I guess my starting question would be philosophical, and that would be, where did Schopenhauer go wrong? Obviously Nietzsche has a pretty big respect for Schopenhauer, but it's a respect as an opponent. He thinks he gets some things wrong. What are and I guess maybe a little speculation, why wasn't Schopenhauer able to foresee those critiques? He's a very thorough philosopher. I mean, he's very analytical. Why wasn't he able to foresee that? Is that just intellectual limitation, or is it something fundamentally about his temperament that blinded him to what you think are those improvements?
Well, basically, as far as Nietzsche was concerned, there were 2 Schopenhauers, one of whom was very interesting, and the other of whom he did not find interesting at all. The first was Schopenhauer, the pessimist, the analyst of humans as not having free will and being, buffeted around by unconscious drives, and human life being far bleaker than previous philosophers were willing to admit, and who was also very critical of, because people forget that Germany in the first half of the 19th century was not industrialized, it was a backwater, and it was dominated by these hyper-rationalistic philosophers, which is German idealism. People think German idealism was something mystical, but it was really this hyper-rationalistic form of philosophy. And, Schopenhauer was very critical of that. And I think on all of those fronts, he agreed. But Schopenhauer also has this kind of mystical notion of the world being fundamentally this result of this unified will. And that's something which Nietzsche never had an interest in and never agreed with. Funny enough, that's what Wagner's the exact opposite. It's Schopenhauer, the mystic, that he finds interesting, and not this kind of stuff. So there's 2 aspects of Schopenhauer which Nietzsche disagrees with. One of them is an intellectual critique. He doesn't talk about this that much, but it is in his early notebooks, and it is the most prominent critique that people have of Schopenhauer generally, which is that he follows Kant in saying that we have this fundamental limitation. Everything that we know has to be that of a subject with his finite experience. And so a concept for Kant and also for Schopenhauer is a distillation of our intuitions from our sense data, and it is a function of judgment. It's something which enables you to make judgments and then turn those judgments into a constellation of knowledge so that you navigate the world not as a schizophrenic. And Schopenhauer cuts down on the Kantian system in a number of ways. He shrinks it into being something which animals could also have. Like he says, an elephant will be able to see that a bridge would be too weak to hold it, and then will not go across that bridge. So he says that elephants have a basic, animals have a basic notion of causality, and everybody has that. But all of your knowledge is via time and space. It's in time and space, and it employs causality to make sense of everything. So the problem is that given that you have this limit on our knowledge, where does his mystical knowledge that the world is fundamentally will come from? It seems to break the limits, the epistemological limits that he sets for himself, that he's able to make this grand claim. Because, and also the world of will, it's what creates the world which we experience. So it has this relation of ground and consequent, to use Kantian terms. And again, you're then applying the categories of your finite experience to something that is beyond that. So again, he seems to be breaking the rules on that because our categories aren't supposed to apply to this fundamental will. So that's the problem, and that's the problem that Nietzsche also had. How do we have knowledge of this? Um, Now, there's also just a fundamental difference, which is what you could call the difference between factual and evaluative pessimism, in that they both agree that life is fundamentally tragic, that you will not be able to pursue your desires and achieve lasting happiness successfully in this world. They both agree with that. But Schopenhauer then says the correct course of action is to renounce life and to live an ascetic life, um, where aesthetic contemplation of things like art can temporarily leave you. You have to renounce life and devote yourself to compassion towards other suffering people. Whereas Nietzsche is not an evaluative pessimist. He thinks that life has all of these problems and he has the same negative assessment, but he thinks that you actually should have a positive disposition towards life. And I don't think that that kind of disagreement is something which you can like mediate. It's like a fundamental different attitude. But those are in a sense the two main things.
Yeah, I guess I tend to believe that the influence of attitude is pretty fundamental, and that's not something you can sort of logic. You can you can take two people and smash them or reconcile those ideas. Um, and I guess one of the ways I'd explain that is just that um, in terms of our senses, which I think is the basis of our attitudes, that two people with two different senses, so someone who's colorblind is going to perceive material empirical reality in a different way than someone who's not colorblind. Now, theoretically, I think one of the reasons why Schopenhauer would see and he doesn't use this term, but I'm going to call it like the logical sense. Why is the logical sense and communing with that and focusing on that, why is that more true and good than these other senses? Is because theoretically the logical sense is interfacing directly with reality as it is, and you're not dealing with this problem of perception. So we can literally directly deal with numbers in themselves when we do mathematics or something. There's no secondary difference, and so therefore it's more universal and it's more true, and we should dwell on that because dwelling in the senses is going to introduce all this difference and all this chaos and all these differences of opinions, and so that's where we can get to unity and get away from the deception that causes all the suffering. That's my impression. And I suppose if you're, if you're like continually betrayed and disgusted and frustrated with your own sensuous experience, then it makes sense. Like that, that argument is appealing because it's, you can, that wheel of samsara idea, that's very intuitively understood by someone who, it goes through that, the story of the Buddha where he has all this wealth and then he realizes it's, superfluous or it's not enough or it gets old. For Nietzsche, it seems as if his life experience was more of um, having some kind of having a greater deal of central attachment, and then I believe he had some sort of disability or injury or something that kind of took him down a notch, some kind of sickness. But he was able to see what life might have been like, or how life could be, what life could have been, and then the contrast of that ability to experience life in that way being taken away in a sharp delineation, and having the contrast toward that. So whereas I think Schopenhauer took the position of, you're always going to be betrayed by the central experience. You're never going to find happiness or satisfaction in that. Therefore, divest yourself from it and try to avoid it at all costs so that you can avoid suffering as much as possible. Nietzsche would say, get it while the going is good, because you don't know how much time you've got till it's gone. So I guess I view that as like having to do a lot with their life experience. There's a funny anecdote I read about Schopenhauer where essentially his father died and left behind this huge inheritance, and it was tied up in the banks. It's weird corporate law, whatever. This is before the Prussians get German conglomerized into one single state. So there's all sorts of bureaucratic nonsense as far as the banking sector goes. And there was something going on where the money was tied up for like 5 years. And Schopenhauer just said, wait the 5 years. And his mother and sister were like, no, we want it right now. And they ended up getting, some pittance. They got like a 10% cut of what they were actually deserved. Whatever the crisis was going on in the banking sector. And he just, he tried to wait. But, is those sorts of like grinding down experiences, like the tedium of life, the ignorance of other people, constantly dealing with people's stupidity, and just like again and again and again, and trying to communicate ideas to people, and they just don't get it. That sort of experience, I think, the tedium of life that he had to deal with for so many years, I think is also part of the reason why he took the approach that he did. Do you have any funny? You're more well-read than me on this subject. Do you have any funny anecdotes?
What's interesting is Schopenhauer objectively had like an easier life than Nietzsche by a long shot. I mean, he inherited, his father made money in finance. I mean, he obviously went into academia and wasn't that successful until the end of his life when his book started to really sell. But whereas Nietzsche was born very poor rural area to like a Lutheran pastor, and he fought in the Franco-Prussian War and then got dysentery, was discharged, and he had terrible headaches his whole life, probably from neurological disease, the same one that killed his father. And yet, it's very interesting then that he is the one with the positive valuation on life, where Schopenhauer is the one who has a very negative one. Although that's only a surface level. I mean, like Schopenhauer, I mean, he thinks that you just oscillate between boredom and broadly failed desire, with very little like happiness that lasts any serious amount of time. Which, I mean, Nietzsche, he thinks it's pointless to try and deny this because he thinks that art is really where you have a reinvigoration and you have this inspiration to pursue life. And he doesn't think that you can, in a sense, justify it philosophically, because that's what happened in Greece, is that you get the development of Socratism, where the idea is, how do you use reason to secure, happiness, eudaimonia? It's not like maybe a modern bugman, toxic positivity, like workplace kind of happiness, but it's still very much that, along those lines. And the same with the Stoics and other forms of ancient philosophy. And that whole branch is a sort of sterilizing dead end for both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. And so that's what they agreed on, but then they had different valuations. Schopenhauer, he doesn't believe in God, but he does believe in saints. He does believe that someone who genuinely renounces life, and he's a sentimentalist. He's not a rationalist about ethics. He doesn't think that you can derive an ethical system. He thinks that you have to just see that other people are going through the same problems that you are, and then you have to use your empathy to have some kind of altruistic outlook in a sort of perennial way.
Yeah, there's a lot of philosophy that I don't know that if I want to cover all these topics today, I don't have time to get into all of it with you. But I want to do the general survey, and then maybe if we do a round two, we can hone in and actually get into the meat of some of these topics. The other topic I wanted to get into was you have an article on Caesarism, where you make the point that you don't think Julius Caesar was actually the main man in forging the Roman Empire, which is interesting because I've just been reading the Discourses of Machiavelli, which is this commentary on Livy, and he's extremely anti-Caesar. I had no clue that Machiavelli just hated Caesar so much. And I guess it's because he authentically was a Republican, despite what people have said against him as being against people and hating humans or something like that, being a misanthrope. But you say that it wasn't Caesar who actually really solidified the empire. It was Augustus, which is interesting. And then you go on in the same article to talk about Napoleon's economic reforms, which, I know about his emancipation of the Jews. I know about his military victories. I know about Napoleonic law, for example. But I've never heard of his economic reforms before. So I kind of wanted to ask you what those were. And then, if Caesarism or Napoleonism is a recurring phenomenon, what would that attitude taken into the present day, what sort of economic reforms would that look like?
Well, you are mixing up Napoleon and Napoleon III, whose economic policies are the people that I talked about in the article. But essentially, what you have is I didn't talk about this because I hadn't read it yet. But Peter Turchin has a concept called the secular cycle, which are these 100 to 300 year long cycles which recur in states. And basically, the main problems that you face is something called the Matthew effect, which is it's a quote from the New Testament, Matthew 25:29, which is to him who hath it shall be given, and from him who hath not it shall be taken away even what he hath. So I mean, obviously this is out of context, but essentially, if you have a lot of wealth, it just generates wealth automatically. And so what you tend to see in every society is a gradual uptick in inequality, where the established elites get an increased amount of the proportion of wealth over time. And at the same time, you eventually tend to get the development of the immiseration of the working class of that society due to an excess of labor oversupply. And because labor oversupply, it tends to decrease real wages. And you also get elite overproduction. So you tend to have a massive uptick in elite aspirants compared to elite positions. And so then you get the formation of counter elites within this system who then appeal to the masses, and then you get breakdowns and civil wars and whatnot. I mean, that's a huge oversimplification, but this is a model with a lot of maths. But essentially, the Republican secular cycle was coming to an end, and you had these latifundia, these big complexes. You had a lot of slave labor, and a lot of like the plebeians of Rome were fed up with the system, and they were downwardly mobile. And so Caesar kind of comes in as a popular general, and he was a much more successful politician in his consulship before he goes off and becomes conquers Gaul and all that. But by the time later he's sick due to disease, and he's not so much of a competent politician, although he still wins the war. But you get this populist appeal from an elite, from someone from the patrician background, who then promises to solve these problems. But my point is that Caesar gets assassinated, and it's Augustus who kind of crystallizes together this whole thing into a comprehensive program for the Roman people. And he organizes together people into a sort of political faction, anybody who had been associated with Caesar. And he's not like a romantic figure. He gets he hires competent people to do things for him, to deal with military affairs for him. Shamefully, I've forgotten the name of the most famous one off the top of my head. But in any case, he's kind of this technocratic figure, but he does get to power, and then he establishes the Principate, which is the new political system of Rome, and he inaugurates a new secular cycle. He deals with elite overproduction. He deals with these immiseration problems. And for hundreds of years, this new political system lasts, which is the Principate. Which eventually falls apart later in the crisis of the 3rd century. But with Napoleon, he's also coming in at the end of the French secular cycle in the 1780s. And he's the person who's able to take over. And yeah, he's most famous for legal reform, emancipation, and very, very successful military campaigns. Although eventually he doesn't really know how to govern at peacetime. So he has 7 coalition wars. He wins 5 of them, but eventually he's pissed off everybody, and he can't deal with them, especially after he loses horses in Russia. But so Napoleon III, he arrives on the scene. He's very parallel to Hitler in this sense, that he has this failed meme coup attempt in 1840, which gets him exiled. But eventually he comes back at the time of the Second French Republic, and he sort of takes over via populism again. And he had concreted the ideas of Napoleon into this book, Les Idées Napoléoniennes. And his economic policy is one of pragmatism. It's free trade insofar as it's beneficial, but protectionism insofar as it's beneficial, so that we can have agricultural independence. It was a massive investment into the railways. You have like thousands of miles, which of course is very beneficial because it increases connectivity and lays the foundation for industrialization. But also, when you invest in the rail, you have to get a booming steel industry, a booming coal industry, and it just leads to massive success. And also, you have huge urban development, massive improvement in sanitation, and yeah, it's a very forward-moving time period. But it's brought abruptly to an end because he was not a good military leader at all, and he gets the whole of Germany to unite against him, and then he loses, and so he's kind of relegated. But in a sense, the reason why I think that Caesarism is relevant is because if you look at a lot of these statistics, you can see that we are actually have the signs of a gradually breaking down society since around the 1960s in Britain, since around about the 1970s in America, where you have an uptick in corruption. You can actually demonstrate that the civil services are becoming more incompetent, more cronyist. You are seeing an increase in inequality. You are seeing immiseration in Western countries, and a lot of that is obviously due to mass immigration and labor oversupply. And so you're essentially gradually laying the groundwork for the breakdown of society in this cyclical form. And so, these people are people who are coming towards the end of these cycles and then are actually pulling you out of the cycle. I don't have a mystical view of these things. They are caused by human decision making and policy. And the point about the economic policies is that every single successful forward developing society has basically been a kind of a state capitalist pragmatic program. It's not as simple as that, but that is the broad picture. So that's why I think that's important, is because you actually can fix a lot of the problems we have. The elites don't want to at the moment, but you could.